origin lies in the proper use of simple hand tools. But to more fully appreciate these tools and their part in our world today, let's turn back the pages of history. 60 or 70,000 years ago, long before the beginning of civilization, our primitive ancestors lived in caves, and we today might also be living in caves, except for a certain event that took place within the gloomy depths of this long-forgotten cavern. Stone Age craftsman by the name of Primitive Pete stumbled upon a very good idea. He suddenly realized that by fastening a stick to a rock, like this, he could extend the length of his arm, like this, and thereby greatly increase the force of his blow, like this. Was born the world's first practical hand tool. Oh, did we say practical? Well, anyway, it was a good idea. In fact, it eventually led to the development of all the numerous sledges and hammers we have today. But more than that, out of Pete's Stone Age hammer came other tools, tools for every purpose. This ball-peen hammer, for example, is just a practical version of Primitive Pete's first crude invention. But like all tools, there's a right and wrong way to use it. There are still Primitive Petes among us today who would abuse this fine tool. And this would be the horrible result. Obviously, this hammer was never intended for crushing rocks. The ball-peen hammer was designed for many purposes. The peen end can be used for riveting. It's also used for shaping soft metal. When using the face, you can avoid damage when hitting a hard object simply by striking with a full face. Never strike the object with the edge. Of course, there are many other types of hammers, all based on the original Stone Age model. There's the brass or copper, the rawhide face, plastic tip, and the claw hammer, which is the most commonly used, or we should say most commonly misused. To use the claw hammer correctly, rest the head squarely on the nail. Give the nail a slight starting tap, then drive it in with steady blows. A long nail can be pulled part way with the natural leverage of the claw. Then a block of wood placed under the head will increase the leverage, making a stubborn nail easier to pull, with less strain on the handle. A hammer with a loose head can be plenty dangerous. Here's how Primitive Pete would tighten the head on his hammer, but that only damages the handle at both ends. Have you a little beauty like this in your home? A steel wedge is the right answer. Driven into the wood, the wedge spreads the handle to the tapered sides of the eye and holds it tight in both directions. Gripping the handle too close to the head reduces the blow and sometimes makes it difficult to drive a nail in straight. Always grip the handle close to the end to increase the length of the lever arm and make each blow more accurate and effective. Never use a handle for a crowbar. That's going all the way back to Primitive Pete. Searching for a tool when you need it takes all the joy out of any job. A handy rack saves your time and temper. For dozens of repair jobs around the home, a wood chisel is indispensable. Here's how to use a wood chisel correctly. To make a horizontal cut, always try to work with the grain of the wood. Ordinarily, to make a roughing cut, the bevel is held down and the chisel is forced into a deep cut with a mallet or hammer. For most work, a thin paring cut is easier to get when the bevel side is up. For fine work, the chisel should be held at a low angle to the wood, slightly turned to one side, and then pushed with firm, even strokes from the worker. Your chisels deserve the best of care. Keep them sharp, polished, and ready for use. Wood planes were developed from chisels. Every workshop needs at least two types: the block plane for small, light work or for planing end grain, and the jack plane for work on larger surfaces. For smooth operation, the plane must be carefully adjusted. If the cutting edge is uneven, sight along the bottom of the plane, then move the lateral adjusting lever, either right or left, to even up the cutting edge. It'll look like this when seen from the front end. To adjust the plane for a thin shaving, turn the adjusting nut until the cutting edge projects about the thickness of a hair. Before you start the plane, be sure the wood is clean and that all nail heads are set well below the surface. Always plane with the grain. Press down on the knob at the beginning of the stroke, then on the handle at the end of the stroke. When storing for future use, a narrow cleat on the shelf will prevent damage to the blade. Guess what's wrong in this picture? Well, in the first place, Pete is using a rip saw instead of a crosscut saw. The rip saw is used for cutting with the grain. It has coarse teeth, usually 5 or 6 to the inch. On the other hand, the crosscut saw has smaller teeth, usually 8 or 10 to the inch. Now, Pete, do you think you've learned which saw to use to do the job right? Ah, that's better. You see how nice and clean that cutoff is? When using the crosscut saw, hold the saw at a 45-degree angle to the board and always start the cut with a backstroke. Holding the index finger along the handle helps to saw straight along the line. For sawing with the grain, use the rip saw. Hold it at an angle of 60 degrees to the wood. Use long, steady strokes, and don't force the saw into the wood. After every use, rub a little oil on the blade to guard against rust. But don't ever do this to your saw. Most of us are familiar with these other special purpose saws: the back saw, the compass saw, coping saw, and this adjustable frame hacksaw, which is used principally for sawing metal. Always place the blade on the pins with the teeth pointing forward. In starting a cut, make use of as many teeth as possible. For example, to cut this angle iron, this starting position would be right. This position of the blade would be wrong. Not enough teeth on the work. The cutting action is similar to a file. So remember to relieve the pressure on the backstroke to avoid dulling the teeth. Certain jobs require a certain number of teeth per inch. 32 teeth per inch would be too fine for this job. 18 teeth per inch would get the job done with less work. But for conduit or any thin metal section, 18 teeth per inch is too coarse. The teeth would straddle the work, stripping the teeth and ruining the blade. In this case, 32 teeth would be correct, since it allows 2 or more teeth on the work at all times. When not in use, the hacksaw should be hung up to protect the blade teeth. Common sense care applies to all our tools. A place for everything, everything in its place. That's a mighty good slogan. Down through the ages, since